The crash was louder than thunder, sharper than the cracking of glass, and crueler than anything either of them had ever known. When the small private plane spiraled out of control and slammed against the waves of the endless ocean, two strangers, one a powerful CEO who had never spent a day without luxury, the other a struggling single dad who lived paycheck to paycheck, were suddenly thrown into a fight for their lives. As the wreckage sank beneath the furious waters, they clung to each other and drifted toward a deserted island, never imagining that their fates would soon intertwine in ways either of them could have predicted. The woman was Victoria Hayes, one of the youngest female CEOs in the country, known for her sharp mind, commanding presence, and relentless drive. People whispered about her in corporate hallways, admiring her brilliance but fearing her ruthless reputation. She had built her empire from the ground up, and in doing so, had walled off her heart so deeply that she barely remembered what it felt like to be vulnerable. Her world had always been one of power and control, but now, stripped of her kingdom and thrown into the chaos of survival, those walls were beginning to crack. On the other hand, Daniel Cole was her opposite in every way. A single father who had lost his wife in a tragic accident years earlier, he worked odd jobs and stretched every dollar just to keep food on the table for his little girl. Life had taught him humility, endurance, and the importance of love, values far removed from the glittering boardrooms where Victoria ruled. Fate had now placed them together, tearing away every mask, every pretense, and every shield. On this island of silence and sand, there was no CEO and no struggling father, only two broken souls forced to survive side by side. The first days were filled with fear and uncertainty. Victoria's hands trembled as she realized there was no phone signal, no assistant to solve her problems, no food except what they could find, and no certainty of rescue. Daniel, though equally shaken, forced himself to steady his voice and guide her through the basics, building a fire, collecting coconuts, and setting up shelter. At first, she resisted his help, her pride bristling at the thought of depending on someone else. But hunger and exhaustion soon taught her humility, and the harsh reality of survival stripped away her need for control. The nights were the hardest. When the sun disappeared and the sky stretched vast and endless above them, the ocean roared louder, as if reminding them of their fragility. Victoria lay awake, her once pristine white blouse torn and stained with salt and sand, thinking about the life she had left behind. She had mansions, cars, and money, everything the world said mattered. Yet here, on this island, none of it could buy her safety, warmth, or peace. She began to see just how hollow her victories had been. Daniel, sitting near the flickering fire, often watched her in silence, his gaze steady and patient. He knew that pain wasn't always written on the surface. Behind her hardened eyes, he recognized the same loneliness that had often weighed down his own chest. Days bled into weeks, and survival slowly forged a bond between them. They learned to work together, gathering fruit, fishing by hand, and studying the rhythm of the waves to anticipate changes in the tide. Each hardship they faced peeled away another layer of distance between them. Victoria discovered strength she didn't know she had, while Daniel found a fragile but growing sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, this island hadn't come to take away everything, but to give him something new. Sometimes Victoria stumbled beneath the weight of her own pride and fear, breaking down in tears as she confessed that she didn't know how to live without control. For so long, she had built her life around order, power, and perfection, and now, on this raw and unforgiving island, all of that had been stripped away. Daniel would listen quietly, never judging her for her vulnerability, only offering the steady presence of someone who understood pain. At other times, when the silence grew too heavy, Daniel would speak of his daughter back home. He told stories of her bedtime lullabies, of how she used to reach for his hand when she was scared, of the little victories that had once kept him going. Her first drawing taped to the fridge, her first school recital. His voice would crack with the ache of missing her, and Victoria could see how deeply love had shaped him, how much strength he carried not for himself, but for someone else. Slowly, almost without realizing it, they began to lean on each other, not just for survival, but for something deeper, something their hearts had long been starving for. Each word spoken around the fire, each moment shared under the vast sky, chipped away at the walls they had built. What had started as necessity was becoming a fragile bond neither of them had expected. One evening, after a brutal storm had swept across the island and torn away half of their shelter, they sat shivering beside the dim glow of a fragile fire. The air was heavy with salt and rain, their clothes clinging to their skin, their bodies exhausted from battling the elements. Victoria turned her face toward Daniel, her wet hair plastered against her cheeks, and in a trembling voice whispered words she never imagined she would speak. "If we can't go back, must I marry you?" It wasn't meant as a proposal, but as a confession, a surrender of all the defenses she had once clung to. What she truly meant was, if the world forgets us here, will you promise I won't be alone? Daniel's chest tightened at the rawness of her question. He reached for her hand, roughened now from survival but still delicate in its trembling, and he didn't laugh, didn't tease, didn't dismiss her vulnerability. Instead, he simply held her gaze, his eyes mirroring the same loneliness and longing that lived inside her. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them, something fragile but undeniable. They realized that this bond was not just about clinging to life, it was about discovering the possibility of love. A love not born out of convenience or desperation, but out of finally being seen for who they truly were beneath the masks the world had forced them to wear. The days grew softer after that night. Their partnership shifted into something warmer, something threaded with laughter and small joys. They began to cherish the little victories that survival demanded, catching a fish together, weaving palm leaves into shelter, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon as if the sky itself was painting their story. For the first time in years, Victoria opened up about her childhood, about the dreams she had buried under layers of ambition, about the loneliness she had disguised with power. Daniel, in turn, confessed the fears he carried as a father, the endless worry that he might never be enough for his daughter, that he might fail her in ways he could never repair. And in those confessions, they found comfort, not in fixing each other, but in sharing the weight of being human. In each other's honesty, they found comfort, as though the island itself had stripped away everything false and left only the raw truth of their souls. Yet the island was no gentle refuge, it tested them relentlessly. Hunger gnawed at their strength, storms battered their fragile shelter and their weary spirits, and the endless uncertainty of whether rescue would ever come threatened to break them apart. Victoria wrestled constantly with her pride. There were moments when frustration boiled over and she snapped at Daniel, lashing out with the sharpness of the CEO she once had been, only to regret it moments later. What surprised her most was that she found herself apologizing, something she had almost never done in her old life. For Daniel, the struggle was quieter but no less heavy. His patience remained steady, but in the solitude of his thoughts he carried the weight of knowing that every day spent on the island was another day his daughter was without him. And yet, despite the hardships and frayed tempers, their bond grew deeper, not because life on the island was easy, but because, again and again, they chose to endure together. Weeks later, when a distant ship finally appeared on the horizon, both of them wept. The tears were not only from relief but also from fear of what returning to the world would mean for what they had built between them. Would the bond they had forged in the crucible of survival survive the transition back to reality? Would Victoria retreat into the empire she had built, hiding once more behind her mask of power, and would Daniel slip back into his quiet struggles, pretending none of it had ever happened? Or had they discovered something rare and powerful enough to rewrite the rest of their lives? The rescue came, but in truth, it was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. Back in the world of luxury and noise, Victoria found herself torn in two. She struggled to reconcile the woman she had become on the island with the figure she was expected to be in her office towers. The mask of control and ruthlessness no longer fit the way it once had, and behind her confident facade, she missed the silence, the simplicity, and most of all, the man who had seen her in her most vulnerable state. Daniel, reunited with his daughter, felt joy deeper than words could describe, yet in the quiet moments when she slept, he found himself longing for something he couldn't explain, not just the island, but the woman who had shared it with him, the woman who had looked at him not as a struggling single father but as a man worthy of being seen. Their lives had been irrevocably changed, and though the ocean now lay behind them, the question Victoria had whispered on the island still lingered between them like a secret vow. If we can't go back, must I marry you? Perhaps love does not always arrive in the ways we expect. Sometimes it takes losing everything to discover what truly matters. And sometimes, the wildest storms do not come to destroy us, but to wash us ashore in the very place we were always meant to find. For survival, they had learned, was never only about food, fire, and shelter. It was also about the heart. Victoria had spent her entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from her money, her influence, her power. Yet on that forgotten island, stripped of all of it, she found something she hadn't realized she was starving for. Daniel never cared that she was a CEO. He cared only whether she could hold the bamboos steady while he tied their shelter, or whether she had eaten enough fruit to keep her strength. For the first time in years, she wasn't being measured by her wealth or her achievements, but simply by her humanity. That realization cracked something open inside her, and in the raw honesty of survival, she began to trust him in ways she had never trusted anyone before.